Yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast, man. We're really excited to speak with you. You're running for Congress in the 10th District of Texas, which spans from the northwestern portion of the greater Houston region, stretching to the Austin area. Could you tell people a little bit about who you are, why you're running?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a former public school teacher, civil rights lawyer, most recently a city attorney here in Austin. And I'm running for Congress to fight for equal opportunity and social justice, to replace a hateful anti-immigrant Republican incumbent here, and provide some real representation in a district that has major needs. Tens of thousands of people without health care, closing rural hospitals. We have long-standing incidents of basically Jim Crow-style policing. This is the district where Sandra Bland was killed in police custody, where we have voter suppression. I mean, there's a lot of needs here, and what's been missing is representation and a progressive voice, and that's what I'm trying to provide.
Wow, that's awesome. We wanted to talk to you first about sort of the situation that we're living through as a country. We're a country that's in dire need of police and criminal justice reform. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have taken to the streets to demand defunding of the police. You yourself recently signed a pledge that you wouldn't accept any donations from police unions. Could you talk about the stranglehold that police unions can have over elected officials, and how you will work in Congress to reform our criminal justice system?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, we have to start this conversation with the acknowledgement that, we have a 401-year legacy in this country of slavery and Jim Crow-style politics, and, the war on drugs, which was basically a replacement for Jim Crow that accomplished the same thing, which was to suppress the Black community, to murder innocent Black people, and to maintain class relations as they are right now. And so I'm very concerned about the influence of police unions on our public safety policy. The idea that a local mayor or city council can barely even ask the question, should we discipline an officer? Much less should we reform the way we respond to public safety needs. And so I definitely support a massive restructuring and rethinking and re-envisioning of how we treat public safety. And, to really ask this question, does sending an officer with a gun and a badge, is that the way we need to respond to the vast majority of public safety concerns? And so in a congressional race, the influence of police money is not as great. And, whereas in local races, if you're running for city council, that police union pack can really make the difference. I don't think it's the same thing in a congressional race. I think it's more likely that the military-industrial complex gets involved to support a candidate than a police union. But that said, it was important for me to sign that pledge because, as someone who's a student of the labor movement, I come from a labor family. My mom was a shop steward at the Machinist Union when I was growing up, working at a Caterpillar factory as a welder. My dad's been a longtime union lawyer. I've been a 2-time union member myself. And when unions join together with movements for civil rights and social justice, it's extremely powerful. And throughout history, police and police unions have been on the wrong side of those fights. And we've seen that recently. I think the incident in Buffalo was the most extreme example, where these officers brutalize and maybe permanently injure this older activist who's basically backing up, and he gets pushed down on his head and he's bleeding from his ear. And they won't even stop to pick him up to ask if he needs aid. And then when these officers are arrested and released from jail, dozens of other officers are applauding as they come out, like as if they should be rewarded for this type of brutality. Yeah. And so we have an institutional problem in this country that's rooted in racism and white supremacy. And I think this pushback against police unions and the role that police have played, in the South, some of the first police officers were so-called paddy rollers, patrollers, searching for escaped slaves. So we have to acknowledge this history and try to eradicate racism by pushing for deep transformational change.
That's interesting. And you're running blue in a pretty traditionally red state. We were talking yesterday with Dan Whitfield, who's an independent running against Tom Cotton in the state of Arkansas. And he actually mentioned that part of the reason he chose to run independent was because of Arkansas voters' preconceived notion about Democrats and just the challenges he kind of faced in connecting with those voters. What has been your experience so far running as a Democrat in Texas? And would you agree that Texas is turning blue, as many people have been saying?
Well, that whole turn Texas blue, it's like a it's a mantra, it's a marketing slogan. It means lots of different things. And it's true that right now Joe Biden is pulling close to Trump statewide, which is a good sign. But I think there's a lot of work to be done to really harness the potential for progressive politics in Texas. And, that whole slogan, any blue will do, that can be problematic at times. I'm running in a district that's not an easy Democratic seat, right? It was gerrymandered in 2003 by Tom DeLay and Karl Rove. It was designed to be a 60% Republican district. And it's only because of the massive demographic change with basically Austin and Houston metro areas growing that this has become even conceivable for Democrats to win. And so there's a lot of push to run as a moderate to basically meet Republicans in the middle. And that's not my theory of how we're going to make political change. I think the way we win in districts like this is by getting people to vote who don't ordinarily vote and who the standard politicians aren't speaking to. And that could be rural folks who basically can't even access all the information that we're reading on Twitter and these other feeds. They can't even get it because they don't have high-speed internet in their community. And there's, the black folks at Prairie View A&M, an historically black college in this district, who've basically been fighting just for the simple right to vote for decades. The Democratic Party hasn't spoken to them, and not to mention the Latino community that's in these kind of smaller towns and mid-sized rural towns. And so, to me, the struggle is to embrace a politics that will really speak to the needs of the people and that will advocate for transformational change, because they make it hard to vote in Texas. There's a lot of voter suppression. And so for folks to make the sacrifices, even just to vote, and sometimes that is a real sacrifice, you have to give them something to fight for. And so to me, that's what I'm trying to do. I think we can certainly win this race in 2020. I don't know if Joe Biden will even invest in Texas. Sometimes my concern is that these polls that show Texas is close, the national politicians just point to that and say, okay, Republicans, you have to spend your money in Texas, and now we're going to funnel all our money somewhere else. And so you really have to invest in this place to win it. I'm not sure if I answered both the questions completely, but
one of the things I just want to kind of expand on that you mentioned is in one of your campaign points that I was, excited about and also surprised that it doesn't get more vocal support, especially from, more quote unquote progressive insurgent candidate, is the lack and need for universal broadband internet. As you've pointed out, the internet was created using public funding, but now access is largely determined by powerful private internet service providers and cable monopolies. Could you talk a little bit about why this is it's so necessary that we fix this if we're going to have a true democracy where everybody is able to have access to the same levels of education and awareness?
That's right. Yeah, no, access to information and the media being a key part of educating the populace. And, so Texas-10, a district, this picture behind me is basically representative of what it looks like in the rural areas. But, 7 rural counties in this district. And there's all these folks out there who don't have high-speed internet. There's a university, Prairie View A&M, 10,000 students. Kids are lucky if they can get a high-speed internet feed. And that's basically access to information. If you're running a business, it's access to your client base. These days, with our kids at home, can't even go to public schools, you're supposed to participate in the public education system through the internet. And so the idea that this isn't a free public service, that you're basically distinguishing between people who can afford high speed and people who can't, it's going to create further stratification of our economy. And so, 100 years ago, they did the Rural Electrification Act, which, helped rural communities come into the 20th century at that point. And I think we need a similar universal broadband investment to guarantee high-speed internet. And I support the demands to do that through existing public institutions like the Postal Service, which has a lot of the infrastructure you would need to kind of spread out the internet in each of these communities, because the market is not going to solve this problem. And like a lot of problems, the market's not going to solve it, because there's not enough money to be made in Bastrop County or Lee County or some of these Texas counties where they don't have the high-speed internet. And so that's where the public government has to come in and stand up for folks, make sure they have the resources they need.
And it certainly would provide a new utility to the Postal Service, which we've recently seen some Republican members of the Senate and Congress sort of come after in recently.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, we got to defend our Postal Service, one of the most popular public institutions, which employs hundreds of thousands of Americans, good quality jobs, a lot of Black Americans. It's a great employer, and it provides an essential service. And so to me, we should be looking at, postal internet, postal banking. We could take on the payday lending industry, by allowing your post office to process your paycheck, things like that.
We wanted to congratulate you as well on your recent endorsement from Senator Bernie Sanders. And also wanted to ask you what your vision for an effective left movement in this country would be moving forward, and how we can maybe continue expanding on the progressive coalition, drawing inspiration from the playbook laid out by Bernie.
Right on. I like the easy question, Gavin. That's a real slam dunk. An effective left movement. I mean, that's been on the table for decades here. And so one of the things I'm really excited about right now is that folks across the country, and maybe not to the same extent in Texas as in, say, New York or Oakland or LA, but you can tell folks are learning. Like, we've had the Occupy movement where folks learned a lot. We've had the police brutality movement, these high-profile police killings, whether it's Eric Garner or Oscar Grant, and folks have been learning how to organize. And one of the things I take a lot of, encouragement from is how, for example, white leftists in this moment, a lot of folks are basically shutting up and listening, right, and following the lead of Black women and Black men who are leading in this racial justice movement. And that by itself represents a lot, because if you were in these previous spaces, you saw privileged white men in particular talking too much and pretending like they have the answers. And so we really have to build an intersectional movement where folks who know the most and are most affected by issues can lead the way, whether it's immigration issues, racial justice, voting rights. And so to me, that intersectional piece was one of the things that did excite me about Bernie's campaign, especially the 2020 race. The idea that you're going to lead on these policy platforms, and then that community is going to take the lead. And so I think in the struggle ahead, right now I would say we're in 4 overlapping crises. It's white supremacy, it's COVID-19, it's the economic crisis, it's the Trump crisis. But moving forward, we can anticipate what the blowback is going to be, right? A big one is going to be a push for austerity. The idea that because we've spent all this money getting out of the crisis, really giving trillions to the wealthiest corporations and tax cuts to the wealthy, but because we've spent all this money, now we have to make cuts, and let's cut the library, let's cut the public schools, let's cut all these social programs. And so I think as a left, we have to fight against austerity, to fight for more robust public spending, to guarantee healthcare, housing, basic income, and to unite these struggles with each sector and segment of the community that's affected. I mean, Black folks are on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are getting sick at a higher rate than white folks, especially in the South. They are more likely to work so-called essential jobs. At the same time, the police are killing them at this ridiculous rate. And so the rocks are lying around. I don't know if you've heard that Jesse Jackson speech, rocks just lying around. The tools are there if we can put them together, if we can organize, and if we can also be humble, listen to each other, and build a broad movement.
I think that's a great segue into talking about how the distinguishing factors between your campaign and sort of the governing style of the incumbent opponent you're facing, Michael McCall, a longtime Republican representative in your district, basically since it was gerrymandered. He was elected in 2005, I believe. And I believe it's also worth noting that he's among the richest members of Congress, and that's going to, influence his views towards the more corporate and opulent. Could you just talk about how your people-funded campaign, sort of differs from his approach in this wave of austerity you mentioned?
Yeah, he's like picture-perfect plutocrat, basically. He's a guy who's worth over $300 million, married into the Clear Channel fortune, now iHeartMedia, who lives in a 7-acre estate in Austin that is known for being the biggest consumer of fresh water. Like their water bills are 20 times the average person's water bills. So he's completely on the wrong side of every issue. He takes more money from corporate PACs than human beings. He does things like advocate to increase the quota for beds at ICE facilities run by private prison contractors while taking money from those private prison contractors. So he's on the wrong side of every issue. But I think the biggest way for me to distinguish myself is to actually show up and listen. Because not only does he have all these terrible policy positions and he's on the wrong side of basically social justice and the struggle happening, but he also doesn't show up. He hasn't held a public event in 11 years. He doesn't listen to questions, doesn't answer questions. And so this is a tremendous opportunity to basically out-organize him, outwork him. It's a little hard right now with this health pandemic, But that's been the strategy, to basically knock tens and tens of thousands of doors, to get the Sunrise Movement of unions and activists to join us in making those direct voter contacts, to raise money from people. I actually raise money from, I raise more money from people who live in the Texas 10th than he does, even though I'm not like a multi-million-dollar campaign. But just to keep doing that work, person to person. And to me, we can be more efficient, we can be lean and mean, and we can beat them with a people-powered campaign.
Absolutely. One of your most powerful campaign videos kind of exposes the heartbreaking effects that the industrialized coal mining has had on Texas communities, farming, and the environment. How has your community and district been specifically affected by the corporatized extraction of natural resources? And what is your message to the politicians who presided over and approved this pillaging? Politicians whose campaigns are funded by big money interests, including the fossil fuel industry.
Right on. So in terms of the impacts of the fossil fuel industry on this district, like you mentioned, we have the coal plant in the middle of the district. It's municipally owned. It's owned by the city and the state in this joint venture. Opened 40 years ago, they promised it would be clean coal. Of course it wasn't. It has led to all sorts of acid rain, groundwater pollution, cancer corridors, asthma. I mean, the video I have out there, it's got this pecan farmer who developed this massive tumor, basically the size of his brain, but also talked about how he used to produce more pecans on his orchard than anyone in Texas, and now produces zero. I mean, it's just this direct example. And of course, the industry has captured all the regulatory agencies. So the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has the mandate from the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act to regulate business and commerce, but does absolutely nothing, just rubber stamps these permits. Doesn't even make sure that it's safe, for the people that live around them. And, adding on top of that, the fracking industry in this district, there's basically unregulated fracking. You can open up a well, it seems like anywhere you want, even if it's next to the water supply in a rural community. And so there's a lot of ways to talk about these issues in a way that even rural, independent, even Republican voters can listen to, right? Because it's like, hey, your water is no good because Greg Abbott, the Texas governor, let his $1 million donor, approve the permit, basically. And then you add on top of that the flooding. So Houston, has had 500-year flood events in 5 years. And it sounds, nonsensical, but these are like supposed to be once in a lifetime flood events, but basically every year for 5 years in a row, including Hurricane Harvey. And it showed how weak our public infrastructure is. And so even though the Houston region is so dependent on oil and gas income, some of my supporters are dependent on that income. Basically half of the AFL-CIO, the labor council for that area, is fossil fuel workers. Even though there's this institutional investment and dependence on fossil fuel money, people are very open to having these conversations. And so it's not like, are we going to confront climate change? To me, that's a given for just about everyone you talk to. But it's, how do we do it in a way that takes care of the workers? How do we have a just transition for these fossil fuel workers so they don't suffer for this big policy shift that is absolutely essential? How do we fund the cleanup for these frontline communities, predominantly Black and brown communities that are located near the chemical plants in Houston, the refineries in Houston? How do we take care of them, make sure they get prioritized for these jobs in a Green New Deal? Because the previous New Deal, for all the wonderful things it did, it left Black communities behind. And so to me, there's a huge opportunity to talk about these things, even though the consultants might tell me not to. I've been to DC and they say, oh, take that off your pamphlet. Don't say those 3 words, Green New Deal. But it's given me a big platform. And even when I went to the Texas AFL-CIO to get their endorsement at the convention recently, there was pushback. The pipeline workers and the coal plant operators, they wanted to endorse a different Democrat who was completely anti-union, but she didn't say Green New Deal. But actually, I was able to get the unanimous endorsement of the Texas AFL-CIO, representing 235,000 union members in the state, because I was willing to caucus and meet and listen to with every single union in the state. And so to me, just that commitment to organize, to listen, that does a lot of the work to provide opportunities, not to be dogmatic, hashtag Green New Deal, shut up, that kind of thing. You can't be like that. But like, if you're willing to have this conversation and connect the policy to people's, personal struggles, that's where I think we have a lot of opportunity.
And you've been a longtime advocate of unions. And I don't think that it's a secret that one of the reasons that the Democrats have struggled with working class voters in the way that they have is because of their adoption of destructive trade policy like NAFTA and TPP, combined with the sort of giving up the fight to protect union workers and the rights that, that did come from the, 30s and 40s struggles of FDR Green New Deal that, as you mentioned before, overwhelmingly left out the minority communities. You've said that if elected to Congress, you'll fight to immediately implement the PRO Act, repeal the Taft-Hartley Act, and abolish right to work laws. Could you talk to voters about what that means and why it's so important we advocate for unions' rights in your district and across the country?
Sure. So, big picture, a union is the representative of the workers, and it counteracts the disproportionate bargaining power that a big employer has, right? If Amazon employs millions of Americans and you're just one warehouse worker, it's hard to have a voice. Even if, some of these effective organizers in New York City, right? It's hard to have a voice. And what a union does, it allows you to combine your voices, to push back, to demand better compensation, better working conditions, and so forth. And, I'm very concerned that the Democratic Party, in response to some of these campaign finance Supreme Court decisions, basically left behind the labor movement, stopped working with working class folks, and started kissing up to, the corporations that can provide big PAC checks. And I think the whole system of political campaigns and a lot of the prevailing consensus in DC, including on the Democratic side, is basically the way you run a congressional campaign is you raise enough money so you can buy $2 million in TV ads, $500,000 in mail pieces, and then, if you have a field program, that's great, good for you, progressive. And so that whole paradigm means you're catering to the folks who can give the big checks the fastest, because if you only have 10 hours to make calls, you're going to call the $5,000 corporations before you call the $5 a month donors. And so all this stuff is interrelated. But to me, the way we win back a progressive vision for this country, and for example, we elect Joe Biden, we elect Joe Biden. I know the two of you aren't going to be, super excited when that moment, but the way I see it tactically, we elect Joe Biden and we keep the movement in the streets and we keep pushing. We keep pushing to get the best reforms we can. If we look at FDR was no leftist when he was elected. This is a guy who made an alliance with the KKK in the South to win his first presidential campaign. Lyndon B. Johnson, no major leftist, right? A lot of corruption there when you look deep. But both those men, when they were in that seat, responded to what was happening in the world, whether it was the Great Depression and the rise of fascism for FDR, or the civil rights movement, the assassination of MLK and JFK for LBJ. And they did the right thing in that movement, partially because the movement demanded it of them.
Yeah, and I think a modern example that's occurring concurrently to our situation would be the Yellow Vest protests, which have erupted in France under the leadership of Emmanuel Macron, who similarly to Biden is kind of a more establishment liberal voice rather than the more progressive anti-establishment voice that we might want, but unfortunately do not have at the lead of the party right now. Mike, it seems like you're the kind of representative that Texas 10th district could definitely benefit from. Is there anywhere where people can check out more about you, learn more about your platform, and maybe donate to your campaign?
Thanks so much, Gavin. I guess we ran out of time. So Mike Siegel, so if you spell my last name right, you can get most of the way there. SiegelForTexas.org, SIEGELFORTXS.org. Facebook, Twitter, Siegel for Texas. And big picture, I'm in a runoff July 14th against a moderate Democrat who's brought in hundreds of thousands of outside spending from an anti-Green New Deal super PAC called 314 Action. And so there is some work to be done just to make sure I secure the nomination. We feel like if we win the nomination, we've got a wonderful chance to win in November. So if any of y'all can phone bank, send text messages, please sign up with the campaign, and look forward to talking with y'all more. We can flesh this out, how to build a real enduring left movement.
That's a great idea.
Thank you so much for your time today.
All right. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Bye.
Yeah.